Well, welcome back. This is our second to last class. That's how I feel too. Last time, in fact, the last few classes, we've been looking at areas of policy remedies for widening inequality, particularly with regard to dealing with poverty. We've looked at various issues of public assistance, talked about the criteria and the question of deserving poor. We looked at healthcare, widening healthcare gaps, and the healthcare gap is growing. We added to that climate and the issues of climate change and how that is in turn aggravating the gap between rich and poor, not only in this country, but around the world. And finally, today we come to an issue that you are all very familiar with because you're all in it. You've all done it. You've all experienced it. We are in it. We are here together today doing it. It's called education. One of the difficulties of talking about education is that we are all experts in it, or we at least feel like we are experts in it because we've all experienced it. But as we go through today, I hope that you, as you have in other classes, begin to think more deeply or more curiously about some of your assumptions about education. Education is, in the United States, a Rorschach test. That is, people see in education not only all of their hopes, but also all of their fears. It tends to be the repository of a political anger and political agendas. It tends to be the place where we assume that basic decisions about who is going to do better and who is going to be doing worse in society are made. We load education up, in other words, with all kinds of baggage that in some ways is unfair. The reason I chose this topic as our last topic for this semester is because I wanted to make sure we all had experienced enough of other issues and other causes and other debates about widening inequality that we would not make the same mistake and freight education with everything else. Notwithstanding, it is important. So today's outline, as we did with healthcare, how does the United States compare? Comparisons give us a pretty good understanding of context, earnings and employment by level of education, early childhood education, something that I have spent a lot of time on. I want to pull you in. K through 12, what's the problem? How to fix it? Higher education. And higher education, is it a public good or is it a private investment? I'm going to repeat that again because under lots of the debates over higher education now is a fundamental debate about what it is. If it's a public good, we treat it one way. If it's a private investment, we treat it another way. We are, frankly, extremely confused, and I will tell you what my contribution to that confusion was and is. But most basically, what's the purpose of education? I mean, there are three purposes that are normally given. What's, in your view, and there's no right answer to this, I just want you to think a little bit about it, is the most important purpose to help people gain the skills they need to do better in the economy? Or is it B, to give people the tools they need to participate in a self-governing democracy? Or is it C, to enable people to have rich and fulfilling lives? Go. Okay, let's end the bidding there. Again, there's no necessarily right answer, but I want you to understand that there are different currents of thought. So most of you, about 45%, it looks like, 156, you say to enable people to have rich and fulfilling lives. And that sort of begs the question of what's a rich and fulfilling life. But nevertheless, that is different than A, although about 27% of you did say helping people get the skills they need to do better economically, and the runner-up was, by a small margin, B, to give the people tools they need to participate in a self-governing democracy. I should say, by the way, that if you go back to the early pioneers of American education, it was mostly B. That is, in the 18th century, in the early 19th century, most public education was justified, legitimized, and developed on the premise that it was necessary for democracy. You couldn't have a self-governing democracy unless people had enough education that they could think critically, they could read about and analyze what the situations were in terms of where they were and what they needed and what their communities needed. A has not really been a fundamental current of debate with regard to education until relatively recently. I would say probably the last 20 years, maybe 30 years. And we will get into this in more depth. C, to enable people to have rich and fulfilling lives. Keep that in mind as we go through today. Because in this course, given all the data we go over, given the discussions we have, it's very tempting to come to the conclusion that the major concern you should have, or anybody should have, is where they end up in the hierarchy of income and wealth. And I hope you don't get that out of this course. Income and wealth are critically important. If you don't have enough to live on, if you don't have and feel like you have less than almost everybody else, or you're deprived in some ways, that has all sorts of psychological, social, and political repercussions. So how do we compare? How do we compare with other nations in K through 12 education? Are we one of the best, about average, or would you say one of the worst? And we're talking now about K through 12. Go. Okay, let's end the bidding there. Not a terribly complicated question, and let's just see. Well, most of you think we're about average, and the second runner-up is one of the worst. Not many of you think that only 8% of you think we're one of the best, the richest country in the world. Well, let's take a look. Now, again, these comparisons are complicated. They're complicated because not only are there evaluative questions about what does best and worst mean, what does it mean to be successful in terms of education, but also the ways of comparing are complicated because we don't have standardized international examinations to understand and evaluate what people know. But let's look. Now, this is a pretty good test, a snapshot of students' performance in reading, mathematics, and science. And we can see here along the left, China, Singapore, Hong Kong, Estonia, Canada, Finland, Ireland, Korea, Poland, Sweden, etc. on reading, mathematics, and science. Let's take a look. The United States is second from the bottom on this list, and we are not doing all that well compared to many other nations. I suppose if you added and looked at all the OECD nations, all the rich countries in the world, we might be doing about average. How do we compare with other nations on higher education? What do you think? Go. Okay, let's end the bidding and let's see what you think. And 65% of you think we're one of the best. And then the next runner-up is about average, and then, so it's just reverse. You think in terms of K through 12, most of you thought we were average or one of the worst, and on this one you think we're either the best or one of the best. Well, let's take a look. Now, this is the U.S. News, so take it for what it's worth. I mean, U.S. News has its own criteria, and those criteria are slightly obscure, but U.S. News is accepted as one of the ratings agencies. Best global universities. Best global universities. We're looking at the entire globe. What does U.S. News say? Well, I don't know what you're applauding, because I mean, Harvard, MIT, and Stanford have no reason being where they are. But it is generally accepted that Berkeley, UC Berkeley, is about one of the best, if not the best, public institution of higher education. And you knew that. I'm not telling you anything you didn't know. You are being educated at the best institution of public education in the world. Do you know that? I want to make sure you know that. That puts you in an extremely privileged position. And the other ones are pretty good. Oxford isn't bad. I went there. Anyway, we can debate the criteria, but it's pretty clear if we had a lot of these, and there are a lot of measurements, the United States has the best or among the best institutions of higher education in the world. But I want you to pause here and think about it. We have a very mediocre, if not poor, system of K through 12 education and one of the best systems of higher education in the world. There is a dissonance there. And how does that dissonance map onto what we've learned this semester about wealth and poverty? Does it? Is there some relationship between what we are now seeing and what we understand about widening inequality of income, wealth, and also racism in the United States? The other thing that's interesting here has to do with the percentage of 25 to 34-year-olds with a college education. By level, we're looking at before, pre-pandemic, and you can see that the United States, there's the OECD average. I don't have a way of actually lighting this up, but you can see the OECD average there, and the United States is sort of a third of the way down. That is, we have a lot of 25 to 34-year-olds with a college education, but others are doing better. If you assume doing better means more college education. But what about earnings? Earnings. I said to you a little while ago, a couple of minutes, that I had contributed to a misperception, I think. And let me explain that misperception, because when Bill Clinton was president, he and I spent usually several days, a month on the road around America, usually at community colleges. And what he would say, and I would say behind him, was what you learn has a lot to do with what you earn. What you earn depends on what you learn. It was a catchy phrase. But what that phrase implied, and a lot of people began replicating it, and it became, after the mid-90s, that's what everybody was saying. But what that implies is that your own personal earnings depend a lot on what you personally have achieved in terms of education. Or to say it another way, education is a personal investment that pays off, or doesn't pay off if you don't get very much of it. in later years. Now, the mindset that sees education as a personal investment instead of a public good leads you to certain kinds of consequences and conclusions that may not be correct, or certainly may be anti-social. Now, the people who were the pioneers of public education in the United States, they saw education as a public good. They saw it necessary for democracy. They saw it necessary, some of them saw it necessary for the production of goods and services, the economy as a whole. But if you think of education as a private investment that pays off for you, then why should anybody else bear the cost of your private investment? You see where I'm going? If you're going to make a lot of money in the future off of your higher education, for example, why is it necessary for others in society, maybe they are not, or some of whom are not going to get a private education, a higher education, why should they subsidize your investment in your own return on that investment? Unemployment and the rate and median earnings by education level. Now, what you're going to see here, we're going to look at doctoral, professional, master's, bachelor's, some college, no degree, high school, and less than high school. And then over here, you'll look at median usual weekly earnings, and interestingly, the unemployment rate. This is useful to us because we've already examined how the level of unemployment, that is the tightness, so-called, of the labor market, actually has a lot to do with what people earn, especially if they're bottom of the education scale. If you're an hourly wage earner without a college degree, without much higher education at all, the tighter the labor market, the more you're likely to earn. If you are somebody who has only a high school degree and the Fed raises interest rates and slows the economy and produces a lot of slack in the labor market, your earnings are likely to suffer before the earnings of somebody who graduated from the best public university in the world, for example. So what you can see here is that there's not much difference between a doctoral and a professional degree. Professional degree, median usual weekly earnings is slightly ahead. Master's degree, you can see here, if you want to conjure up a return on private investment framework, you can see it's very easy to do that. And you can see also at the bottom, less than high school or high school diploma, high levels of unemployment. Supply and demand. As you go up the unemployment rate, that is, it's very, very hard to get professional degree or doctoral degrees people. If you are hiring, you're going to pay them more. Median lifetime earnings by education. Again, at the left, less than high school, some college, all the way professional degree. Pretty direct relationship. Median earnings by education, race, ethnicity, and gender. We're now piling on several variables. But what you can see here, and it's complicated, I know, and those of you who are graphophobes, I apologize. But what you can see here is that if you are a black female or black male, you can do much better with more education, but you're not going to do that much better than, in fact, you're going to do worse than a white female or male at almost every level of education. Which gets me to the beginning. I don't know how many of you were in nursery schools or childcare or any kind of intense early education. At the age of 3, my mother was working, so she put me into what we then called the local nursery school. Miss Boughton. Miss Boughton was about 150 years old. Her great-great-grandparents were in the Revolutionary War. She was really a terrible, terrible person. That's unfair. I shouldn't say that. I was only 3 years old. How could I evaluate? But one day, my mother got a call. My mother was at work. She got a call. It was from Miss Boughton. She expelled me. I was expelled from nursery school. Why was I expelled from nursery school? I was expelled from nursery school, according to Miss Boughton, because of excessive sarcasm. Now, how can a 3-year-old be sarcastic? What happened, and I'm piecing this together because my mother was so upset, and it's a long time ago, but what happened was Miss Boughton would serve these almost inedible lunches. And I, even at the age of 3, wanted to be very polite. And Miss Boughton would say, "Bobby, you didn't eat anything. Was it okay?" I said it was absolutely delicious. That was the final straw. When do you think the educational achievement gap between high and low income children peaks? At what age is it actually the largest? When do you see that gap growing? Do you think it's by age 2, by 5, by 10, by 15? What do you think? Go. Let's take a look. Well, so most of you, almost exactly the same number, think it's either by age 5 or by age 10. And most of you don't think it's 2 and don't think it's 10. So it's 5 to 10. That's when you believe the mind, the human mind, the neurons are really charging in a big way. Let's take a look at what we know, what science tells us. The achievement gap is set by the age of 5. And here we're looking at years on the horizontal and the score in standard deviations. Now, again, I want to assure you that I know that you know that all of the tests that are given to 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds that are called, whatever they're called, if they're called IQ tests, whatever they're called, are culturally biased. They're not very good measurements. How can you possibly measure that? But what is useful here is to see patterns. And what you see here is that when parent income is in the highest quartile, there is a pattern with regard to child achievement. And there's a pattern with children from families in the lowest quartile. And you see how critically important, whatever test you're giving, and whatever the validity of that particular test, the pattern is the same. The little neurons, the little brains are coming together. Those first years are critically important. I learned not to be sarcastic. My first big lesson. That wasn't true. I learned a few other things. Which means that early childhood education, and when I'm talking about early childhood education, let me define the term. Early childhood education is different from childcare. Early childhood education means, according to educators, a lot of attention, quite a lot of personal attention given to children, a lot of stimulation. Now, as you move toward child care, and a lot of children don't even have child care is usually group care. It's not a great deal of personal attention, not a huge amount of stimulation. And then you move to what I had after I got expelled was basically the television. I mean, there's not much else. Not huge amount of personal attention, in fact, none. And in terms of stimulation, very, very little. What I want to emphasize with you, though, is that early childhood education in terms of personal attention and stimulus is important, because we can see there's a peri-preschool study. There are right now about 12 different studies, longitudinal studies that go over long periods of time, so you're able to actually measure what happens to these children. And each of these studies has a control group, because they were the people in the study who were selected for early childhood education were selected randomly. And so you know that the control group is a pretty good measure of what happens when you don't get something. This peri-preschool study is a typical study. What do we know? The program group is in blue, the non-program group is in brown, and arrested 5 or more times by 40, earned at least $20,000 at the age of 40, graduated from high school, basic achievement at 14, homework at 15, IQ, well, again, everything I said about the perils of measuring IQ. Let's take a look, because these are very significant differences. And I want to remind you, this is a randomized study. Who got into the highly stimulative, highly attentive preschool and who did not. There are lifetime differences, big lifetime differences. Whether you have this kind of treatment or don't have this kind of treatment, as a small child makes a big difference. This is one of the few areas of education where we have a lot of good data. I want to just mention that almost everything we have touched on this semester has a bearing on the ability of young minds to learn. It's not just stimulative early childhood education. I mean, for example, if you're a kid born in a very poor family, we've already examined asthma, difficulties with regard to health care. We've looked at all sorts of things. Well, poor eyesight. I remember kids in my first and second and third grade, we were trying to learn, we were trying to read, and there were a couple of kids from poor families, and I remember the day when the teacher and the school realized they couldn't see. They couldn't read, they couldn't see the board. Nutrition, we've talked about that already. How can a young child learn, a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old, if their stomach hurts, if they haven't had a dinner, if they haven't had adequate nutrition or enough nutrition? Or how can they learn if they could not sleep, if because there's so much noise in the house or on the street? Asthma, breathing difficulties, little or no opportunity for exercise, violence and abuse. My point is that you can't separate out any of these. It's not simply a matter of giving a child good early preschool. It is a whole environment, which again is one of the reasons I postponed this week until nearly the end of the course. K through 12, family, income, and race. We've done this before, but I want you, in the context we're now talking about, to talk about this with us. I attended a custodial K through 12 school, now where the tacit curriculum, when I say tacit curriculum, I mean what the school is really trying to do, what its most important goal is. In that kind of a environment, a custodial environment, it is to keep children safe. A second kind of school is a factory, K through 12. I went to one of these K through 12s, where the tacit curriculum, what's really going on is the production of lots of identical products, almost like a factory where you're moved along on conveyor belts. And you have the same thing done to everybody on that particular conveyor belt. When I went to high school or K through 12, there were different conveyor belts depending upon what the school assumed about you and your ability to learn. And the kids who were middle class or upper middle class were on the faster conveyor belt, and the poor kids were on the slower conveyor belt. And there was just a lot of identical products. The education was not tailored to anybody. And then C, a pressure cooker K through 12. But the tacit curriculum in the pressure cooker K through 12 is dealing with stress, dealing with pressure. Teach the kids how to endure stress, get them into good universities. Which did you go to? Go. Well, let's end the bidding here, and let's take a look. Well, it looks as though almost half of you learned, although you may not be able to, you were in a pressure cooker school where the tacit curriculum was how to endure stress and get into a good university. Many of you were in a factory K through 12 school, like I went to, public school, standard public school curriculum, and about 15% of you were in custodial schools. Now, I'm going to tell you, for those of you who went to a custodial school, you already know what it's like. When I was Secretary of Labor, I, with the Secretary of Education, went around the country and we visited a lot of what I came to regard as custodial schools. They're not labeled as such. This is the typology I've given them. But when you enter into a custodial school, you enter through a lot of barriers, police. There are a lot of ways of filtering out, making sure people don't have knives and guns. And when you go to a classroom, usually the door stays open, if there is a door at all, because the major concern of teachers is to keep children safe. And so if there is a problem inside the classroom, immediately help can be summoned. But those classrooms tend to be very loud because there's no door that shuts. And I could go on, but those of you who went to a custodial school, you recognize the description that I just gave you. The annual household spending on children. What I'm going to show you is something that surprised me when I first saw it. Now, along the horizontal bottom axis, we start in 1980. We're going up to 2015, the last date for which I have good data. But you can see what the pattern shows. And this is in 2018 dollars going up the vertical axis. Annual household spending on children. Well, the highest quintile, the highest 20%, the richest 20% of households, they're spending more and more and more on their children. And the spending is on education, all sorts of goods for the child. But you can see when you get to the fourth or the middle or the second or the lowest 20%, there's a huge fall off. Why are parents in the top 20% spending more and more on their kids? Why are we seeing this pattern? And by the way, the not such great data I've seen since then shows that the highest 20% is moving at a very rapid pace up to even higher. Why is this? Is it rich families have become so much richer that they can more easily afford to spend more on their kids? Or B, the return on all educational investments has increased substantially? Or is it C, that families in the bottom 80% don't have access to many of the educational enrichments available to the richest families? Just an access issue. Or is it D, income and wealth at the top have soared so much that it's worth trying to get your child to the top if you possibly can afford to do so? Go. Well, let's end the bidding there and take a look at what you believe. And it turns out most of you, 55% of you, think it's C. Families in the bottom 80% don't have access to many of the educational enrichments available to the richest families. And I guess the runner-up is D. Income and wealth have soared so much that it's worth trying to get your child to the top if you possibly can do so. Well, let's look at the data. Let's look at what we can figure out on the basis of what actually has happened. If you can afford to do so, it's worth trying to give your child every advantage. The richest Americans have seen their incomes soar since 1980, as we have seen in this course. So the opportunity cost of not giving your child every possible advantage, if you possibly can, is higher and higher and higher. The golden ring is more and more golden. When I was in school, yes, parents who could afford it would do what they could for their kids, but the race was not really that important. The stakes were not really great because inequality was far less. If you made it into a good university, a good college, fine, great. If you didn't, okay. If you didn't attend college, too bad. Not a big deal. Now the stakes are huge and growing. If you don't go to college, you are on a downward escalator. If you go to college, you have a chance. If you go to really good college or prestigious college or university, you have a very good chance. Chance of what? Chance of great wealth. One of my sons, when he got to be 16, came to his mother and me and said, sit down, please. I just want to tell you something. We sat down. He said, I've been doing very well in high school, haven't I? Yeah. I've got almost all A's, right? Oh, yeah. He said, good. I just wanted you to know that because I'm dropping out. I said, what? He said, yeah, I'm dropping out. And I don't want you to be concerned because I know exactly what I'm going to do. And I have a job lined up downtown. I'm going to work in a music store, and I'm moving into an apartment. Don't worry about a thing because Elaine and I are moving in together. And don't worry. Everything's fine. I said, Sam, you can't do this. And he said, Dad, chill. So it wasn't a request. It was a sort of a very kind, somewhat patronizing information. Well, Sam dropped out of high school. Having been through all of this and having been with Bill Clinton, you earn what you learn and you learn what you earn and all that, I was worried. His mother was devastated. Elaine? He's moving in with Elaine? We barely knew Elaine. What do Elaine's parents think about you moving in with Elaine or Elaine moving in with you? You're only 16 years old. How old is she? She's 16 years old. You're getting a job? You're getting your own apartment? Dad, don't worry. Well, Sam is now 38. He is married to Elaine. They live in LA, and he runs and owns a company called collegehumor.com. And how did that happen? Well, when Sam was 16, I said, what do you want to do with your life? He said, Dad, I want to make videos, and I'm going to post the videos on the internet, and they're going to be comedy videos. I said, how do you know this? You can't, first of all, comedy and videos and internet are all three separate industries. He said, they're coming together, Dad. I use that and share that with you only because there are exceptions to all of these rules. There are exceptions to all of this data. But the exceptions almost prove the rule. And Sam, by the way, he did have every advantage that his mother and I could possibly give him. Access to the internet. Well, if you are a poor kid from a poor family, how are you going to be fully educated if you don't have access to the internet these days? Take a look. We're looking at lower income Americans have lower levels of technology adoption, and then the percentage of children ages 3 to 18 with no internet access at home by family income, race, and ethnicity. You can see big differences based on income. First of all, in terms of smartphones, desk, laptop, computers, home broadband, tablets, all of the above, big differences. Children with no internet access at home, less than $10,000, 57%. This is as of 2019, just before the pandemic. By the way, if you have no internet access at home and you went into the pandemic, what did you do? Remarkably little discussion about something like this. High school dropout rates are declining for Latinx and Black people. And this is one of the most dramatic changes. This is up to 2016, continues to go down. It's one of the most dramatic changes over the last 25, 30 years. But why? Why do you find such dramatic decreases? Is it because parents and their children are learning about the size of the earnings premium for graduates? Or is it B, schools are under intensifying pressure to graduate their students, even those who are not adequately prepared? Or is it C, there are fewer job opportunities and lower wages for high school dropouts, so less opportunity cost for staying in school? Okay, let's end the bidding there and let's see what you think. Well, about half of you think that it's C, there are fewer job opportunities, lower wages for high school dropouts, so less opportunity cost for staying in school. And that implies, and I think those of you who did come out here with C, that you know that if you are in a poor family and there are good jobs or relatively good jobs out there with relatively good wages, that's a big opportunity cost of staying in school. The family may want you and need you to go out and work. But maybe if there are fewer job opportunities, what you are saying, there's less of an opportunity cost. B comes in second. And that is, there's great pressure on schools to graduate students, even those who are not adequately prepared. And the data does tend to support B. Ever since the educational reform movement of the late 1990s, early parts of this century, there has been greater and greater pressure by most states on high schools to graduate their students. They're rated by graduation rates, which has a kind of perverse incentive attached to it if people graduate who don't actually have all that they need. I mentioned a second ago education reform, and there has been a huge fight, and you were probably, many of you, in the middle of this fight over tests. In fact, what happened starting with the George W. Bush administration, is that nationally there was a movement to test, to hold teachers in schools accountable for the results of their students' test scores. And as a result, there was a lot of testing and more testing and even more testing. And the problem is when you just test students, what are you measuring? You're measuring their ability to take a test. You're not necessarily measuring their knowledge. You're not necessarily measuring their ability to apply any bit of knowledge or wisdom or information. You're measuring their ability to take a test, which is fine. When I went to high school, we had in New York State, the Regents exams, and for every major subject, we had one exam at the end of the year, a high-pressure exam. It did tell a lot. It did give a lot of metrics. But when you just teach to the test, teachers are not invited to be creative. Schools are under great pressure, and you are teaching people to take tests. My sister was a teacher, a 10th grade teacher, public high school in Massachusetts, and she was in the middle of all of this, and all she did, she would call me at night screaming. She said, all I did today was administer tests. That's all I did. Well, tests for the purpose of taking tests may create the semblance of accountability, but there must be better ways of holding schools accountable. The other big fight and the other big policy debate has been over, and again, you may have been in the midst of this, charter schools and vouchers. Charter schools and vouchers. I, years ago, made a recommendation in an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal in which I said what we really ought to do, because the conservatives all wanted vouchers. It sort of was a free market idea that if you allowed parents to basically make the decisions for themselves, give them the money. Let the parents have the money that the state would otherwise spend or the locale would otherwise spend on schools, so the parents could make the decisions. It would come in the form of a voucher. Well, a lot of conservatives liked that idea. A lot of liberals did not like the idea. What a lot of people on the progressive side said was, no, you don't want to do vouchers because, well, I mean, the kids with the biggest social problems and the poorest kids, they're going to get stuck in the quote unquote worst or least desirable schools, and you don't want that kind of sorting. So I came up with an idea in my op-ed for the Wall Street Journal. I said, why don't we do this? Why don't we have vouchers, but the amount of the voucher will be inversely related to family income. So a poor family, for example, might have a $15,000 a year voucher per child to spend on education, and a rich family would maybe have a $1,000 or $2,000 voucher to spend on education. And that seemed a good trade-off. I thought liberals would like that in terms of the sliding scale, and conservatives would like the voucher idea. It turned out nobody liked the idea. I antagonized conservatives, I antagonized liberals. I only got one positive response, and that was a phone call from the governor then of Florida, Jeb Bush. He said, great idea. Well, it went nowhere. The fight over vouchers is a complicated fight, and it is part of the fight over what we might call the privatization of education. The problem is we don't often know what we're debating. We're debating symbols. We may not be debating reality. Should public dollars be used for vouchers for charter schools and religious schools? Yes. One side says, choice and competition will force all schools, public and private, to be better. And vouchers give poor kids a real choice. Why not enable poor kids from poor families to have a real choice instead of condemning them to basically no choice at all? And then the other side says, no, public dollars should not be used for schools that can skim the cream or teach religion. And by skimming the cream, in this context, in this debate, what's meant is that those particular charter schools or semi-private schools, they can choose which students they take, and that means they will take, back to our sorting mechanism, they will take the students who are easiest to teach, have the most promise, who are not going to provide or create behavioral problems. What do you think? Go. And let's look. Well, most of you, but not a huge margin, 64%, you're saying no, public dollars should not be used, and 134% of you say yes. Suppose we were to say that a charter school or a semi-private school or actually any school can be set up that meets a bunch of criteria. And those criteria include they have to accept every student who applies. And if they don't, it's got to be a random assignment. They can't kick a student out because the student is not performing well, and so on. That is, we would create what we consider to be public criteria for the so-called school. Whatever you want to call the school, a charter school, a public school, a private school, doesn't matter. And that all of those schools that meet those criteria would be eligible for public dollars. In other words, you're defining a public school differently. That's beginning to happen. A lot of charter schools in some states that are called charters are actually public schools that meet minimum public criteria for getting funding. Oh, this is my Wall Street Journal proposal. Pay no attention. Jeb Bush liked it. But at the least, reduce or eliminate dependence by schools on local property taxes. We've seen this before. We've revisited this. That is, there are huge differences in the school's ability to provide a good education based upon segregation by income into different educational districts. Give poor school districts more, not less funding. Of all of the advanced countries, all of the OECD countries in the world, the United States is the only one where the poorest kids get less funding, public funding, than the rich kids. It should be, arguably, the reverse. Reduce racial segregation. In 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court said separate is not equal. If you segregate kids, the poor kids, mostly disproportionately black kids, are going to be segregated, and they cannot have, by definition, an equal education. Segregation means that you are condemning those kids to an inferior education. Well, what's happened by now, as we have seen in some of our other weeks, there has been a return to segregation through the back door. More and more children of color are together in schools that are predominantly schools of communities of color. In fact, by some polls, by some ways of measuring, there are more students today who are in segregated schools by percentage than there were in 1954. Give students choice of attending any public school, as I just said, in a wide geographic area, but define public so there really is equal opportunity. Well, these are four of the ideas that are gaining traction. I offer them to you only because as I study this and talk to educators around the country, these are more or less consensus ideas. They're gaining consensus. If you read the press and the headlines, it looks like schools are battlegrounds. Battlegrounds with regard to what books are allowed in school libraries, battlegrounds with regard to what's allowed to be taught in schools, battlegrounds with regard to everything. But actually, those are just the headlines. Underneath the headlines, there is more and more consensus. The biggest issue still on the table is school funding. What about higher education? In your view, what should be the most important criterion for admission to a university? Is it A, likely success in the university in terms of it receiving good grades and graduating? Or B, how much value the university is likely to add to an applicant's skills, insights, and knowledge? Or C, the applicant's overall ambition, drive, eagerness to learn? Or D, how much the applicant is likely to improve society after they graduate? Go. Okay, let's end the bidding there and let's see what you think. Well, you're a little bit all over. The winner in terms of highest percentage looks like about almost 40%, 39% is C, applicant's overall ambition, drive, eagerness to learn. Hard to measure. Possible. You could have kind of secondary proxy measures. And many of you, it looks like most of you are divided between B and D. How much the university is likely to add to an applicant's skills, insights, and knowledge, or how much the applicant is likely to improve society. Very few of you like A. But guess what? A is what got you into Berkeley. A is the dominant criterion for getting into any, certainly, selective university. It makes, on the face of it, very little sense. I mean, if you're already likely to succeed, if you already know, or if you already have all the skills you need, why do you need to go? In a way, doesn't it make more sense to look for the people who have the greatest drive and ambition and also can gain the most from the university? And they may not be the ones who are most likely to succeed on the tests. Interestingly, there has been a dramatic increase in the percentage of population completing 4 years of college. Now, when I went to high school and then went on to college back in the dark ages of the, when was it? Middle, late, past century. As I said, going to college was not such a big deal. Most people did not. Most of my friends did not. I did. But look at what has happened. Percentage of the U.S. population who have completed 4 years of college or more from 1940 to 2020 by gender start in 1940, and you see a huge, dramatic increase up to 2019. And by the way, the dark line is female. Today, 60% of the undergraduates in higher education are women. You may applaud. But that does raise interesting sociological questions in terms of everything. Money, leadership, status, the kind of society we're going to have. I think it's great, but it's different than it was. But what's really different is look at that trend line in terms of the number of people going to, the percentage going to 4-year universities. And by the way, this trend line is not just the people who are graduating from college. This is the overall population. I mean, what we know right now is that over half of kids who are graduating from high school are going on to university. Do you have to have a university four-year education degree to make it in America now? To join the middle class? Was not always that way. Whatever happened to vocational or technical education? Other countries have complicated, well-developed systems of technical and vocational education. If you go to Germany, for example, you know, a 16-year-old will make certain decisions. In France, a 15 or 16-year-old will make certain decisions, and their family will make decisions. And based upon their aptitudes and based upon their ambitions, they might be going to a technical college or a technical university, or they might spend 2 years in sort of a technical field. Why should everybody have to go to a 4-year college? Isn't that kind of a conceit? So what happened? Is it there are no longer good jobs for people with only vocational or technical degrees, or rightly or wrongly, most families now believe a college degree is the only gateway to the middle class? Or C, America never built a high-quality vocational technical education system? What do you think? Go. Well, there's a close call between B and C, and there is a lot of evidence for C. That is, America really never built much of a vocational technical education system, certainly compared to most other advanced, rich countries. When I was in high school, and maybe this is the same when you were in high school, there was a vocational track. That is, the kids who probably would not make it into university were unfairly, in my view, unfairly, because they're late bloomers. There are a lot of people who bloom very late, but at a very early age, they were selected out and they were put on the vocational track. And what the vocational track did, at the end of the vocational track, they did not go into a system of vocational technical education. They just basically went to work. Community colleges in the United States, in my experience, and I've done a lot of work with community colleges, are the crown jewels of our educational systems. But they are dramatically and drastically underfunded. Some of them do provide vocational and technical education, but the beauty of a lot of community colleges is that they also provide launching pads, if you do well in community college, for people to move on to 4-year universities. And as we talked about first class here in this course, many of you, a remarkable percentage of you, moved from community college or from a 2-year college to Berkeley. You transferred. That is one of the great strengths of the California system of higher education. Who completes college correlates increasingly with family income. And what you're seeing here is, again, a trend line. Going up to 2020, you can see that the bachelor degree attainment by age 24 for family members by family income quartile from 1970 to 2017 dramatically varies with family income. Graduation rates at UC campuses. Now, the UC system, as you know, has a rich array of UC campuses. I've been on, I think, every UC campus. I think I've lectured on every UC campus. I've enjoyed visiting UC campuses. They are very different. But one thing that I have been impressed by or depressed by is that they're also very different in terms of family income. And take a look here. The graduation rates vary dramatically by UC campuses. Over here on the left, we've got Los Angeles and Berkeley. We've got a 6-year rate in dark and a 4-year rate slightly in lighter gray, and you can see how different these campuses do, or rather I should say the students at these campuses do, and there is some correlation with typical family income. That is, once again, it's not getting into college, it's actually staying in college. That seems to be a great variable depending upon your family income. Black and Latinx students who complete high school are almost as likely as white students to enter college. And this you see. Again, the trend line here is pretty encouraging in terms of where we've come as a society. Black and Latinx students being able to get into college, but here's the thing, not complete college. Graduation rates from the first institution attended for the first time, you see that there is a big difference. And you could look at graduation rates within 4 years, that dark green, there is a big difference between, for example, white students and black students and Hispanic or Latinx students. It's not getting into college, it's not completing high school anymore, it's staying in college. And you should be asking yourself, well, why is this? What's the biggest impediment to Black and Latinx students completing college? What do you think it is? Is it their high schools haven't prepared them for higher education, or systemic racism pervades higher education and they're discriminated against? Or is it they're disproportionately poor and they can't afford it? Or the opportunity costs, income from jobs they might otherwise have has grown too large? What do you think? Go. Most of you think it's systemic racism pervades higher education. They're discriminated against. But coming very close behind B is they are disproportionately poor and they cannot afford it. Well, let's take a look at what the data might suggest. Now, as we've seen in this course over and over, systemic racism pervades almost everything. That's why it's called systemic. That's why it's so difficult to root out. But let's take a look at college tuition and fees. This is both public and private universities. Maybe this will give us a clue. And starting with 1980, going up to 2020, well, over here is the Consumer Price Index. That's basically inflation. And you can see the college tuition and fees have grown, particularly since the mid-90s, but exceedingly faster, accelerating since 2000, faster than inflation. The cost of college as a share of income for the poorest 25%. What do we see? We see a dramatic increase. Now, it's true, most colleges, most public universities, and many private universities do provide scholarship aid and try to deal with some of these costs, but this is net of scholarship. As college costs have accelerated, it's harder and harder for kids from the bottom 20% by income to afford it, and for their families to afford college. The cost of UC education, not including room and board, I came here in 1968 as a research assistant for a professor of architecture. I thought I wanted to be an architect. And I enrolled in certain courses. My cost of attending University of California, Berkeley was $25. And I remember thinking to myself, well, that's a lot of money. Why couldn't they just make it free? I mean, why $25? Public education used to, again, the days when it was considered to be a public good, was a very different animal. What's the main reason tuition and fees are rising so fast, even in public universities? State funding is dropping, federal funding is dropping, university costs are rising. What do you think? Go. Well, most of you say it is because university costs are rising, but there are a lot of you who say it's because state funding is dropping. Let's take a look. Tuition and fees rise in order to make up the shortfall. Well, you can see tuition and fees, state general funds, student tuition, UC general funds. There has been a dramatic decline in state funding. Is California making a mistake? Where can the marginal public education dollars do the most for lower income families? Making four-year colleges and universities more affordable? Is that where you want your, by marginal, I mean the extra dollar, the additional dollar? Or is it to making two-year community colleges more affordable? Is it to improving K through 12 education in poor communities? Or is it making early childhood education more available and affordable? Go. Let's end the bidding and let's see where you would put that marginal dollar. There's a lot of interest all across the board, I suppose, mostly improving K through 12 education. But remember what I said about early childhood education. Remember that investment is paying off so dramatically. Now, this is your values based upon where you are, what you know, some of the discussion we've had today. My value, if you're interested, would be, I think the biggest payoff of the extra dollar would probably be making early childhood education available. But most of you do not think that making four-year college and universities more affordable is the best use of that marginal dollar. And that's really what a lot of states struggle with. It's too bad. If I were governor, if I had an infinite amount of money, I would spend much more on education in all these respects. Graduates of elite colleges are earning more. But graduates of low-ranked colleges and universities are earning less. This is also something that is under the radar. The top 25% of bachelor degree holders, they have done better and better, but look at the bottom 25% of bachelor degree holders. They are doing less well over time. And this is looking at full-time workers since 2000. Well, this is actually important because a college education, what this tells us, is not necessarily a good investment. It's not a great investment if you are not attending a very good college. You see, for employers, a college degree is a signal. It's a powerful signal. A college degree from a prestigious university is an extraordinarily powerful signal. But a college degree from a non-prestigious, even university that most people have not heard of, or employers have a very difficult time evaluating what it means, becomes no signal at all, and it could even be a negative signal. For-profit colleges. What we know about for-profit colleges, and I'm sure there are some for-profit colleges and universities that are perfectly good and doing a good job, but what we know generally is that for-profit colleges and universities are pocketing a lot of money, student loans, money that is coming from the federal and state governments, and they are not generating students who are getting good jobs. They are diploma mills, and many students, particularly poor students, disproportionately Black and Latinx, they are going and they are dropping out, or they're never getting a degree, or they're getting a degree that is not worth anything. Meanwhile, at the other end of the spectrum, elite universities, elite colleges, University of California, Berkeley can't get more elite in terms of prestige as a public university. What do we know? Percent Pell Grant eligible. Pell Grant eligible. What does that mean? That's a proxy for a student who is from a family of modest means. Usually family income under $60,000 a year. UCLA, 36% Pell Grant eligible. Berkeley, 30% of our students are Pell Grant eligible, but go down to Princeton, 16%. Brown, 15%. Is it that Princeton and Dartmouth and Brown and Harvard cannot afford to admit more students from relatively low-income families? No. Stanford, 15%. Half of Berkeley, half percentage of Berkeley. What's going on? Why can't Stanford afford to take in more lower-income students? More students in elite colleges are from the top 1% than from the bottom 40%. And here, again, it's interesting to see what is happening over time. This is the class of 2002 up to the class of 2013. The same, just extrapolate. You see the same. The share of students at elite colleges whose families are in the top 1%, more and more of the entering classes. And what we've said here today, the trends we've looked at, should explain much of this. And by the way, I'm not blaming anybody whose family is in the top 1%. I'm just simply pointing out that more and more of the places in elite institutions that lead to very, very good paying jobs are going to children of families that are very, very well off. This is a system that is perpetuating and aggravating and widening inequality. Again, I am not blaming anybody. I'm just sharing with you the data. So what is it? Should elite colleges be prohibited from giving preference to children of alumni? As a condition of getting federal aid, I mean. By the way, there's been and continues to be a big debate in this country about affirmative action. That is, giving preferences to certain people, whether they are poor or whether they are from families who are Black or Latinx. But what about affirmative action for children of alumni in terms of preferential treatment? Affirmative action for the children of people who give a college a lot of money. Or prohibited from giving preferences to children of the wealthy. Or required to give greater preference to children from low-income families. Again, should they be? Now, I'm not saying they should be. None of the above is a possibility. Go. Well, it turns out you're a little bit undecided. That is, most of you are saying, I think you're saying, don't give preference to children of the wealthy, presumably families that have contributed to the university, but don't give preference to children who are also children of alumni. But some of you say required to give greater preference to children of low income. and about 9% of you say none of the above. Look, I don't know what the rules should be. I'm just saying that because the federal government is involved in giving a lot of money to both public and private universities, research assistance, Stanford is getting, as we talked about a couple of sessions ago, when we talked about taxes, a great deal of money. So there is a case to be made that the federal government can condition that federal money on blank. And maybe it's nothing, but maybe there ought to be more discussion about this kind of affirmative action. Student debt. It now totals $1.7 trillion. And as we talked about when we looked at, I think it was about 5 or 6 weeks ago, how bankruptcy laws do not allow students to reorganize their debt under bankruptcy. And that's another victory for the banks and the financial industry. So what's to be done? Some arguments against canceling debt. I mean, as you know right now, and many of these issues, as in other weeks, are issues that are right on the public agenda. And right now, Joe Biden, he has the power, by executive order, to cancel student debt or cancel some student debt. And here are the arguments against. One estimated the cost of $1.7 trillion is enough to give every child in America good preschool education. Maybe that's not the best use of that money, canceling student debt. Maybe it ought to be used for other purposes. Or it would help many who don't need it because they will have large future incomes. The whole point of student debt is the notion that you can take on the debt now because you can pay it later because you'll make money later. Or 3, those who have already paid off their student debts, and then suddenly Joe Biden cancels student debts, how would you feel? You'd feel like you were a chump. Or it won't help those who are just entering college and taking on student debt because this was a one-time debt reduction or payment. These are arguments that I hear over and over and over again about why Joe Biden should not, by executive order, cancel student debt. I'm assuming, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, because I'm assuming that most of you would probably be in favor of canceling student debt. Okay, should Biden cancel all student debt? Yes or no? Go. Well, I obviously didn't do a very good job, did I? About 77% of you say yes, he should, but there are 22% of you say no. And 1% of you says, I don't know. Another option, by the way, that you might want to consider, and I have been trying to get people interested in, is that tie debt payments to income. So those with the highest incomes after they graduate pay, for example, 10% for their first 10 years of full-time work, 10% of their income for their first 10 years of full-time work, while the lowest earners pay, let's say, 2% for the first 10 years of full-time work. So the highest income earners are subsidizing the lowest income earners after they graduate. Why not? Why not? You might want to talk about that in your sections. Or allow former students to reorganize their debts under bankruptcy, or make public higher education free, paid for by taxpayers the way it almost was when I was here at Berkeley in 1968. But this really does get to 4 central questions of education policy, and I want to leave you with these. Early childhood education, why aren't we doing more? We have evidence of huge returns on that public investment. Some of the best evidence we have, and they keep growing over time. The cost of not doing it is greater than the cost of doing it by far. K through 12, money and/or reform. What does reform mean? Certainly. But also, why are we still using an antiquated method of paying for anywhere from 20 to 50% of our K through 12 education, and that is local property taxes? We've been through this before. When America's segregating by income more and more. What should be done about increasingly unequal K through 12 resources by income and community? And access to higher education, how do we improve access? And also, should there be more alternatives? Why are we subjected, every family and every young person, to the notion that the only way into the future middle class is through a 4-year university college degree? Aren't there and should there not be alternatives? These are some of the questions. What I want to stress with you in conclusion is that one of the basic issues underlying all of this is whether and to what extent education is a public good necessary for our democracy, necessary for our economy, necessary for our future, or is it a private investment whose benefits adhere primarily to the investor? No easy answers. See you next week.